Hello. Today I'd like to talk to you about Norwich once more, but this time I'd like to talk about multilingualism in Norwich. Now, today, if you walk down a street in the centre of Norwich, you may hear several different languages being spoken. Certainly English, but others from Europe and from outside Europe. So it's become quite a multilingual city. But if you go back, say, 50 or 60 years, then it was probably less multilingual, tending towards monolingual. The language you would most probably have heard would have been English. There were varieties of English, of course, as there are today. The local Norfolk dialect and something closer to Queen's English might have been heard on the streets. So it was quite a monolingual city in those times. If you go back 300 or 400 years, though, you might have heard several different languages. It was more multilingual in those days. The main reason for that was that thousands of people had migrated to Norwich from the Low Countries as a result of religious persecution and economic need. So you had not only speakers of English, but also speakers of Dutch dialects and French. And you might occasionally have heard some Latin spoken as well. Let's take a closer look at each of those. So first, English. That remained the dominant language in the 16th, 17th century, but there were different varieties of English. The Norfolk dialect, again, and as I said in my last podcast, some people might have used the zero ending, he, go. Other people might have spoken a higher register of English. They may have used the TH or the S ending. There would have been dialectal words you might have heard, but also words that were more common across other parts of England. So there was some variety in the English. As for Dutch, well, at that time, Standard Dutch was only in the process of emerging, so the use of dialects was quite strong. These dialects were dialects of what we call Nederduits, Low German in effect, and that word Nederduits gives us Dutch. Many of the migrants, a majority in fact, came from Flanders, and so they spoke varieties of Flemish. If we look at letters that some of them wrote to relatives back home, we see dialectal features. For example, in other varieties of Dutch, the word is was spelt is, but the Flemish spelt it es. And there are other examples of dialectal features in their letters. So most of them were speaking something like a Flemish variety. Others were speaking Brabants from what is now northern Belgium in the area around Antwerp, and others would have been speaking Zeeuws, spoken in Zeeland, places like Middelburg. If we go down the road to Great Yarmouth on the coast here, there was another Dutch-speaking community. Most of the people there spoke Zeeuws. So you had different varieties of Dutch spoken in Norwich, although most people who spoke Dutch were speaking the Flemish variety. If we look at French, the situation is even more complex. Again, at this time, Standard French or King's French was emerging. Some people may have spoken that, but many of those who came to Norwich were weavers, artisans, and they were speaking dialectal varieties of French. The commonest that I've identified is in fact what we call Picard, spoken in what is now northern France. And Whereas in King's French, one might say je suis. In Picard, one says je suis. If one sees the film Bonjour chez les Ch'tis, you get an idea of the dialectal variety that might have been spoken in Norwich at that time. But that's not the end of the story. Some English people were probably learning French. They might have spoken French with an English accent. And then there was law French. In the wake of the Norman conquest, French had become the language of the law courts in many cases, and the influence of French continued in the law courts into the early modern period, giving rise to law French. One person who used law French extensively was Edward Coke. He was born in Norfolk, educated at Norwich Free Grammar School, and then went to university, came back to Norwich as a recorder, and he wrote books in law French. And it was only in the 18th century, in fact, that a law was passed to make English the main or only language used in law courts. Although, of course, we still have lots of French and Latin phrases in legal terminology these days. So there were different types of French being used. And then we come to Latin. Well, in contrast to the other three languages, which were vernacular languages, Latin is a classical language. It wasn't anyone's first language at that time. It was the language of education. So in Norwich Free Grammar School, for example, most of the texts that they studied were in Latin, and the pupils, all boys, were expected to speak Latin. They spoke Latin in their playtime. One of the pupils, called the lupus or wolf, would go around checking that his fellow pupils were speaking Latin. I don't know what the punishment was if they weren't speaking Latin, but they were asked to speak Latin. Others didn't use Latin all the time, but may drop Latin into their vernacular speech or writing. A good example of this is Sir Thomas Browne, a physician and author, perhaps the most famous and indeed perhaps the most intelligent citizen of Norwich in the 17th century. He often switches from English into Latin and sometimes Greek in his letters as a social marker to show that he's an educated person and to create a link with his correspondence. So Latin was being used by, if you like, the educated elite in Norwich in the 16th, 17th century. So you have the three vernaculars, English, French, and Dutch, and several varieties of those. And you have the classical language, Latin, being used by people who've had a good education. So we could call Norwich a quadrilingual city in the early modern period. Perhaps we could call it tetraglottic. Other languages could have been heard from time to time, perhaps Spanish, perhaps Italian, but it was essentially a quadrilingual or tetraglottic city. So that brings us to the end of this podcast. Thank you for watching and goodbye.